Whenever I wasn't with her and there were sort of older white women around, they were incredibly, they were grabby. Like, I got grabbed and pulled onto someone's lap once. She had a hand up my t-shirt. She was all giggling and laughing with her friends. She sort of stopped a bit when she heard my accent, but really, she carried on. I mean, she would have carried on if I didn't stop her. And that was my first experience. That's the first time I realized that this country...
What's happening now is not much different from what happened during slavery. What could white grannies do with black male slaves? Well, you might be surprised after finding out how they pushed ethical limits. Back in the days of slavery, it was in trend for white women to be sexually pleased by their black male slaves. It has just become a fashion. Married white women would fulfill their sexual desires with black male slaves, which they could not do with their white husbands. And young adult white girls would use black male slaves to explore their sexuality. But what about the older white women? Mostly they were white grannies who owned more slaves than anyone else. That's because mostly their husbands were no longer alive, and they had inherited those slaves from their husbands. Yet no one paid attention to what those white grannies did with so many strong black male slaves at their homes. That's when you should know about the nasty and disgusting sexual lives of some white grannies. They introduced new sexual pleasures and distorted behaviors that we see today. But what were those? In this video, let's find out.
The Black History Archives.
The history of American slavery is filled with numerous accounts of severe exploitation and abuse, one of which includes the disturbing practice of voyeurism by some white women, including older women or grannies. These women derived a perverse pleasure from watching or orchestrating sexual encounters between their white daughters and black male slaves. Voyeurism involved these white grannies gaining sexual satisfaction by observing intimate acts between their enslaved black men and their daughters. This behavior highlights a grotesque abuse of power and a complete disregard for the humanity and dignity of the enslaved individuals. Because they themselves could not engage in sexual encounters due to their age, this could not stop them. They had invented a new and nasty form of sexual pleasure which did not require their participation. White grannies, leveraging their social and racial dominance, engaged in voyeurism as a means of deriving pleasure from the humiliation and subjugation of the black men they enslaved. By orchestrating or observing these sexual acts, they reinforced the power dynamics that kept enslaved people in a perpetual state of degradation and fear. This was not just about sexual gratification, but also about asserting dominance and control. In most cases, the white girls used were actually their own white daughters. That's because, as we discussed earlier, having sexual relationships with black male slaves was a fashion. Instead of looking for black male slaves and making efforts to arrange secret meetings with them, white daughters could simply tell their mothers about it. In other cases, white grannies and mothers would encourage their granddaughters and daughters to think about having sexual relationships with black male slaves. And when they accepted that, they offered to arrange for them in return for one thing. They could be allowed to see the whole sexual encounter. White grannies would simply sit near the bed, and their young adult white daughters and black male slaves would do what the women wanted: hard sexual encounters. The practice of voyeurism by white grannies was a part of the broader spectrum of sexual violence and exploitation that characterized slavery. Enslaved black men were dehumanized and treated as property, subjected to the whims and desires of their owners. The forced sexual encounters they endured were a direct assault on their bodily autonomy and personal dignity. For the white women involved, particularly the elderly grannies, this voyeurism was a way to exercise their power and fulfill their desires without engaging directly in the acts themselves. They could exploit the racial and social hierarchies to orchestrate scenarios that brought them pleasure, all while maintaining control. But things did not stop there. In some cases, elderly white women of slave-owning families actively participated in the orchestrated sexual encounters between enslaved black men and their white daughters. Their motivations were varied, but often included a combination of sexual gratification, a desire to control and dominate, and the perverse satisfaction of asserting their power in the most intimate ways. Their white daughters felt white grannies were arranging everything for them. However, they did not know that white grannies had plans to become part of the sexual encounter. Only seeing did not give them complete pleasure. Therefore, white grannies arranged for sexual encounters to take place in the private quarters of the household. These settings were often secluded to prevent detection, allowing the grannies to maintain control and oversight without interference. Here's a reminder to please support us so we can make more videos for you by subscribing to our channel and giving the video a like. We want to build a strong community, and we need your support. Let's continue now. In some cases, the grannies did not merely observe, but actively participated. They might instruct their daughters on sexual practices using the enslaved black men as subjects for these lessons. This could include guiding their daughters on specific techniques or behaviors during the encounter. This was quite important for white mothers who wanted their daughters to know everything about sexuality, preparing them for their marriage ahead. The granny's involvement was also a form of psychological manipulation, creating a situation where the daughter was expected to engage in these acts under the guise of familial instruction or moral education. Grannies positioned themselves in such a way that allowed them to watch or even physically intervene during the encounter. They could be present in the room, sitting in a chair, or lying in bed, using their presence to dominate the situation and reinforce their control. The granny's actions added a layer of humiliation for the enslaved black men, who were subjected to not only sexual exploitation, but also the invasive scrutiny of their owners. This humiliation was compounded by the knowledge that their intimate acts were being observed and critiqued by a figure of authority. The grannies derived a perverse pleasure from their involvement. This pleasure was both sexual and psychological, rooted in the power dynamics and the ability to control and degrade. The scenes were designed to maximize their gratification while ensuring the complete subjugation of the enslaved men. For the enslaved black men, the involvement of the grannies in these encounters further dehumanized them. They were objectified not only as property, but as tools for the sexual pleasure and control of their oppressors. Being subjected to such acts by the elderly women who held power in their lives compounded the abuse, leaving deep emotional and psychological scars. Many of the white grannies were indeed over 60 years old and may have been considered unattractive by societal standards of the time. However, their old age did not diminish their authority within the context of the slavery system. They wielded significant power over enslaved individuals who had no autonomy or rights. To fulfill their sexual desires, these older women utilized the physical attributes of younger and attractive black male slaves. These men were often chosen for their strength and attractiveness, which were seen as desirable traits by the slave owners and their families. Enslaved black men had no choice but to comply with the demands of their white owners and their families. Older white women could use their authority to coerce these men into sexual acts. The enslaved individuals faced threats of violence, punishment, or further degradation if they resisted. The sexual encounters were orchestrated to serve the grannies' desires. These encounters often took place in private settings where the grannies could control the situation and derive their pleasure without interference. In such cases, when white grannies were alone with the black male slave, a moment came when the power structure changed. Being sexually pleased, white grannies would ask for more extreme performances. Given their old age, white grannies were less likely to become pregnant. This factor made them more inclined to engage in sexual activities with enslaved men, as they were less concerned about the potential consequences of pregnancy, which could complicate or expose their illicit activities. Due to this, these older women could engage in these acts more frequently. The exploitation was not a rare occurrence, but a part of the broader pattern of abuse within the institution of slavery. But things didn't even stop there. White grannies had distorted and twisted desires, one of which was deriving sexual pleasure by punishing and beating black slaves. At that time, it was unknown. White slave-owning families did not understand why some white women were obsessed with punishing and beating their slaves, but now we know that it's a form of sexual pleasure. The power and control made them feel satisfied. Many elderly white women engaged in punitive practices against enslaved individuals, finding a form of sadistic gratification in their suffering. This behavior was driven by the power dynamics inherent in slavery, where the ability to inflict pain and control was intertwined with personal pleasure. Sadistic acts could occur both publicly and privately. In some cases, the punishment of enslaved people was done in a manner that was intended to be humiliating and degrading, serving as a display of power and control. For some elderly white women, the act of punishing enslaved individuals was not only about asserting dominance, but also about deriving a perverse sexual pleasure. This sadistic pleasure was intertwined with their role as authority figures, where the act of punishment became a way to fulfill deeper, darker desires. This sadistic pleasure manifested in how punishments were administered. Excessive brutality or prolonged suffering could be employed as a means of deriving sexual or psychological satisfaction. One woman who was famous for doing this was Delphine LaLaurie, a well-known socialite in early 19th century New Orleans. Her name is now synonymous with one of the most horrific cases of cruelty in American history. LaLaurie lived in a grand mansion on Royal Street, a testament to New Orleans' rich cultural and historical heritage. To the outside world, she appeared as a wealthy and respected figure. However, behind the grandeur of her home, LaLaurie's treatment of her enslaved individuals was known for its extreme cruelty and inhumanity. The first reports of her abuse began to surface in the early 1830s, revealing the harsh and brutal conditions she imposed on her slaves. The full extent of her cruelty was uncovered in a dramatic turn of events in April 1834. When a fire broke out at the LaLaurie mansion, firefighters discovered a horrifying scene. The fire exposed a hidden attic that functioned as a nightmarish torture chamber. Inside, rescuers found enslaved individuals who had suffered severe and grotesque abuse. Some were shackled, others had been mutilated, and many were in a state of extreme physical deterioration. The attic was described as a torture chamber, with reports suggesting that LaLaurie conducted horrific experiments on her slaves, involving severe abuse, mutilation, and neglect. Details of the abuse varied, but reports included accounts of enslaved people being beaten, starved, and subjected to cruel medical procedures. Some suggested that LaLaurie performed gruesome experiments on her slaves, including live dissections. The discovery of these atrocities caused outrage throughout the community. The mansion was subsequently destroyed by a mob seeking retribution, and LaLaurie fled the city to avoid capture. Despite widespread condemnation, her ultimate fate remains unclear, with some sources claiming she spent her remaining years in France. Let's be honest. Isn't it true that older white women and grannies are still attracted to black men, and that's why they go for vacations in black Caribbean and African countries? Did you know that the origin of this is in slavery? In the comment section right below, let us know your opinion on whether black male slaves earlier and black men today are preferred because of their sexual prowess. Would you like us to make more videos? If yes, please support us by subscribing to the Black History Archives and clicking the bell icon. You can check out more videos on our channel too.